Thanks everyone for being here. I really appreciate how early you've woken up. Thanks to Emily and Jeff and Roxanne. I'm going to be talking from a handout here. This is kind of an experiment, so we'll see how it goes. You'll see that my title here is Pedagogical Implications of Aspirational Rhetorics, Framing Learning to Write as an Extension of Learning to Religion. And I've organized this around two questions. The first question is, what is an aspirational rhetoric? And then the second question is, what does it mean for there to be a religiously rooted aspirational rhetoric? So the connection with writing will come at the end there. So I want to first tackle, what is an aspirational rhetoric? I define an aspirational rhetoric as a way of approaching any rhetoric in which a person is simultaneously committed to a certain rhetoric and in aporia, that is at a loss or stunned or stuck about it. So my study is particularly dealing with an aspirational rhetoric of anti-racism in the context of an urban farm. So you'll see a graphic there that indicates two kind of church buildings and a flower. I'm working with two different churches. One is a mostly African-American church, a little bit older, very somewhat traditional, and they decided that their pseudonym should be First Church, out of the book of Acts, where the early church is committed to racial reconciliation. The second church I'm working with, in true Presbyterian fashion, called themselves Second Church. Second Church is young, white, super well educated, and very much interested in kind of experimental, whole body type of expressions. And Second Church, 6 or 7 years ago, wanted to begin an urban farm. And so they partnered with First Church, and they border a neighborhood that's mostly African American, and Second Church has started an urban farm there. And so that is their main point of relationship and connection. And at this point they experience that kind of with some joy, but also with a lot of sadness, because the farm, it functions in a lot of ways as kind of a white enclave in this black neighborhood. So last summer, we did an inter-church small group focused around race. Some mostly white people from Second Church and some mostly black people from First Church had a set of conversations. So this is the data that I'm drawing on in this presentation. So if I'm looking at an aspirational rhetoric of anti-racism, where all of the people at Second Church feel very strongly committed to being in relationship with their African American brothers and sisters and being connected with them, and they have really felt the weight of systematic injustice, and they don't know where to go with that. We can also imagine other ongoing situations in which appropriate rhetorical response is murky. So I'm thinking here, maybe we could find aspirational rhetorics of equality in response to wealth inequality, or nurture in response to global climate change. Or it doesn't even have to be really socially oriented. I could even imagine an aspirational rhetoric of profitability in an ailing business. The two key things that I look for are commitment and aporia. The reason I draw on aporia as a term is because it comes out of the ancient Greek world of philosophy, where Socrates was the deliverer of uncertainty and aporia. So aporia for Socrates, as written by Plato, was this kind of transformative moment where you unlearn some of what you had certainty about, and then you can move to a new place. So what is common to commitment and aporia is that there is an affective and internal component to those both. And so that means that can be contested, but it also, I think, asks for some more theorizing about the affective part of that. I wanted to focus a little bit more on this contested element of aporia. So I mentioned that Socrates is a big fan, but aporia is very difficult to sit in. In fact, this concept of aporia has been carried over into race communication. And Warren and Hitton say that for a certain type of people who are locked into this aporetic response, it only leads to self-pity and immobilization. In other words, aporia is white guilt, and it's just another way to maintain white supremacy. In contrast, we see kind of pushback against that theoretical position. So I'm thinking here of Ann Diller, who writes in Education, and she has this really poetic description of the value of being in this. She says, the capacity to be torpified, drawing on the Greek there, bears close family resemblance to the ability to be awed, to be surprised, to be astonished, to be moved in a deeply moral or ethical or aesthetic or epistemological or ontological way. And we actually see this kind of conflict come out in some of the participants. So one of the white women, Aviva, says, that's definitely the hardest part for me, is like having confidence to move forward with, I don't know, like appropriate humility, not debilitating humility. So there we see a hint there that she is drawing on a religious term, but also seeking to modify it in ways that she hasn't come into except for in this encounter with African Americans. So we can think of an aspirational rhetoric, kind of talk about it generally in three different ways. One is to talk about an aspirational rhetoric in the sense of what is a person's ideal. That's the next place I want to go to. We can also talk about a person's actual muddled, halting performance of their ideal and kind of see how that progresses or changes over time. I want to move into that in speculation toward the end of this presentation. And then a final way is we can see an aspirational rhetoric through the discursive construction of aporia and commitment. And we can kind of ask some interesting questions about that I'm going to skip over for now. So on the basis of what is an aspirational rhetoric and with a strong understanding of that, I think we're prepared now to move into the second question. What does it mean for there to be a religiously rooted aspirational rhetoric? I have three answers here. The first answer is essentially a definitional answer. That it means that the ideal is articulated with religious terms. So we can see this in the inset there. This is Aviva's letter that was inviting people from First Church and from Second Church in to participate in these summer conversations around race. And you can see it's very informally written. She has the beginning, the big idea, the plan. I want to draw out the way that she's articulating the ideal or what she hopes will happen through recourse to spiritual language. In her first subpoint of the big idea, she says that the goal is to become closer sister churches and to gather together to fellowship. In the second part, she says that the goal is healing. If we move down toward what the plan is, what they plan to do are essentially spiritual activities. Sure, there's going to be breakfast and conversation, but there's also going to be prayer, song, sharing peace. If you look at where, it's at spiritually or religiously charged atmospheres. It's at the prayer garden at the farm, or it's at the church. And then the most important part here is how. This is Aviva's representational ideal of how do we move forward together? What are we trying to do? And she says, recognizing that these conversations may be difficult, intense, or emotional, at times evoking feelings of fear, guilt, embarrassment, anger, or frustration, we all commit to practicing humility, vulnerability, trust, forgiveness, empathy, and above all, love and grace toward each other in the way of Jesus. So that to me speaks to a very strongly religiously rooted aspirational rhetoric of anti-racism. And this leads us into the second idea of what does it mean for it to be a religiously rooted aspirational rhetoric. And this is a methodological answer. I argue that, at least in my situation, what it means is that it supports doing analysis with people on their terms. In other words, I can't just translate Aviva's forgiveness and trust and love and grace into secular terms and say that that's what we're pursuing, precisely because the ideal is something that is not actually met. And so their ideal, actually our ideal, only actually exists in this religious ideology. And so one of the ways that this plays out practically for me is that I've shared Aviva's letter here inviting First and Second Church into this project. I actually used this as part of the IRB approved consent form. This was the description of the project to the IRB. And so I'm kind of in an ongoing sense attempting to have an EMIC or self-understood explanation of what people are doing in this case. I want to move now finally toward implications for composition studies. So this is, what does it mean for there to be a religiously rooted aspirational rhetoric in terms of implications? In other words, so okay, let's say that there is. Now, what does this mean for us? And I want to just kind of mark out that these are speculative, tentative. They're more ideas based on where I've come from than things that are supported through what I have already studied. But I have three answers here, or three suggestions. I wonder if people with a religiously rooted aspirational rhetoric may first see their rhetorical performance as growable. So this is one of the ways that Second Church's non-evangelicalism really comes out. They are focused on practices. They're focused on living into virtues. They have a non-modern linguistic ideology. And so this also comes back to the title of my presentation here. To religion is kind of a neologism that relates to some of the neologisms that they coined themselves about doing church, where it's seen as an activity that is undertaken, where they themselves are affected and changed through that process. So that's one aspect. I wonder if a second thing is that people with a religiously rooted aspirational rhetoric may be open to inquiry as a means to not stay stuck. So I'm thinking of inquiry here really drawing on Linda Flower and her two key components, which is first that uncertainty should not be threatening, and second that difference is not a problem but a resource. So that has really revolutionized, I think, in some ways, compositionist approach to composition. And I think that actually people with a religiously rooted aspirational rhetoric are well prepared for that same move. The third suggestion that I want to make is that people with a religiously rooted aspirational rhetoric may experience what I call an agentic flip in which others lead. So teachers often talk about using rhetoric as a way to take agency and to empower people. And I want to problematize that a little bit in the context of whiteness. Because I think in some situations taking agency would actually be inappropriate or malicious or construct a view of the world that is individualistic and egocentric. And so an agentic flip designates how rhetoric could be used to acknowledge the ways that people are dependent on others. In this situation, people at Second Church feel very stunned and in need of people to guide them. They need to be the people who are led. And so, in a compositional sense, this would imply that one way to empower others is to actually disempower yourself. I think this is kind of a pedagogy for the privileged. And it could be a potential method toward counteracting white American egocentrism. So those are the directions that I've thought of so far. And I look forward to taking your questions. Thanks.